Why are we here, Maggie?
Okay, we're here because, I grew up in Ely, born in 1991, went to college, didn't even know what Palestine was, to be honest. I remember I got to college and one of the people on my floor at school who lived on the same dorm as me, he was Palestinian. And I said, "Oh, you mean like you're from Pakistan?" He said, "No, like I'm Palestinian from Palestine." And so that was my introduction to Palestine. And we're here because with everything that's been happening in Gaza over the last, it's like a month and a half now, I've just felt such a deep desire to do something and also felt more disconnected from the issue than I ever have and like less, I don't know, yeah, capable of speaking out in a way.
hmm I think it's a smart way to try to speak out because it allows for a lot of nuance, right? It's not
Hmm.
just a social media post. It's not short form, it's long form.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this conversational format hopefully gives you the opportunity to, or it definitely gives you the opportunity to rewind
Yeah.
or yeah, there's just opportunity for nuance.
And
Let's
I want to say thank you for being willing to do this because I reached out to you about a week ago. I've been thinking about different things I could do, write an article to go in the Ely Echo, post things online, but I just needed a way to get my thoughts out and really just share my story. And I know that you are such a great person for that, doing that for so many other people in the community. So thank you for agreeing to just have this discussion
Mhm.
in a way that then hopefully I can post and share with my community, share my thoughts.
Definitely. I love asking probing questions.
Mm-hmm.
I like learning, and this issue is a painful one
Mm-hmm.
um, for so many people. So I think I'm excited. I don't know. Excited obviously is not the right word
Mm-hmm.
because the
But
content is of such an heavy and painful nature. But I'm glad to be here.
yeah.
Let's give listeners a timestamp. So it's Friday, December 2nd,
Mm-hmm.
Saturday, December 2nd, excuse
Mm-hmm.
me. And it's like 6 o'clock or something.
Yeah.
So it's evident that things can change really
Yeah.
quickly in this scenario. Um,
Mm-hmm. And when I reached out to you was before the pause happened of
right.
the bombardment of Gaza. And then this week there was a pause. And since then, since yesterday, the Israeli government has resumed bombing Gaza. And already, I think it's over 100 people have died,
Mm-hmm.
including many children. And I think for me, like what I have to share is based on experiences that I had 10 years ago, 7 years ago. And it really feels timeless in a sense, like almost like regardless of what is currently happening on the ground, I think the stories that I'm going to share, you know, are relevant.
Yep.
Yeah. But that is the context that we're speaking in.
Yep. So you said that you shared your first exposure to Palestine.
Hmm.
What life experiences have you had that gave you more exposure?
Yeah. So on campus, I was a peace and global studies student. I was so excited to study conflict and how to try and resolve it. I grew up, with my parents protesting the Iraq War and just with like a deep passion for social justice. And on campus, there were a number of active Jewish folks and Palestinian folks who were all campaigning to end the occupation of Palestine. And so that was really my introduction. I remember going um, to just a couple students. There was a Jewish student and a Palestinian student sitting in a room, and there were maybe 30 students who came and attended, and they just shared their own stories of the occupation and their own kind of development of their understanding of why the occupation should end. Um, and so I joined Students for Peace and Justice in Palestine on my campus, and I joined Boycott Divestment Sanctions campaign, which is a global campaign started by Palestinian activists to try and nonviolently pressure the Israeli government to stop the occupation of the West Bank and to stop further forming settlements in the West Bank. And so all of that was learning for me. Like, I didn't know what any of those words meant. So for folks listening who don't know what that means, basically in 1948, before 1948, there were Palestinians and Jews living alongside each other in land that has been called Israel and has been called Palestine at different times historically. And the nation of Israel was formed, right? Like, Palestinians say the border crossed us. We didn't cross the border crossed us. And so folks were uprooted from their homes violently, forced out of their communities, and forced into an area called the West Bank and into Gaza. And in 1967, there was another war where the state of Israel also took more land. And so many Palestinians who live in the West Bank, live where their family has lived for centuries, and others live a couple hours from where their family has lived for centuries, but they're unable to return to those homes. And then there's also Palestinians who live in what is now the state of Israel. About 20% of the population of Israel is Palestinian, and the other 80% is Jewish Israelis. So, and some of those folks have also lived there for a very long time, and some of those folks also moved there to help form a Jewish state. And and then in the West Bank, what the settlements are is that there are some Israelis who believe that all of that land should belong to the state of Israel, and that there should not be any land that belongs to a state of Palestine, and that so they'll go in and they'll basically occupy people's homes, kick people out of their homes, bulldoze their homes, and build their own settlement there. And so that continues to happen more and more. And that is illegal by international law, and it was illegal by Israeli law. I'm not sure what has happened under Netanyahu, the current prime minister. But there's many Israelis who don't agree with that practice, and many others who do.
Right.
And so that was what our work was to try and end the occupation, because in the West Bank, the Palestinian government, and in Gaza, the Palestinian government doesn't have full reign over their own country.
Right. It's not a very sovereign place.
Yes, exactly. And Gaza was more, and Hamas was the elected government there. And then in the West Bank, that's where the occupation exists in a more clear kind of way. Like, when you go into the West Bank, you have to, when I would cross, because I studied abroad in Jordan, which we'll get to, but when I studied there, you have to cross through Israeli military buildings. You don't get across the border with Palestinian guards. You get across the border with Israeli guards, and then you're in Palestine, like you're in the West Bank, but still there's the policing along the roads. There's checkpoints set up by the Israeli government where you have to go from one city to another, or even from one part of the city to another. You have to go past these checkpoints that are run by the Israeli Defense Forces.
What are they looking for?
They're just looking for any signs of a threat, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's
so,
yeah.
Excuse my ignorance.
Yeah, no, I love it. Please feel free to ask questions.
So I have sort of a vague image in my mind of the map, and I can see the West Bank blob, and I can see Gaza. They're both Palestine?
Yeah, they're both Palestine. And some people would say the whole nation is Palestine. It was called Palestine, including where Israel is now.
Right.
So, yeah, they're both Palestine.
And they have two different governments?
Yeah, they have different governments.
So the West Bank has its own political system.
Yeah.
And Gaza has its own political system.
Yeah.
And when people say the Gaza Strip, are they talking about Gaza? It's just a different way to say the same thing?
Yeah, because there's also Gaza City, which is in the Gaza Strip.
Okay.
So the whole area is called Gaza.
Okay.
But the way that the Israeli government has handled Gaza is by turning it into an open air prison, in the sense that it's extremely difficult to enter or to leave, especially for Palestinians. There was a person at my school from Gaza. He's just like a super smart neurobiologist. And there were times where we would not know, oh, is he going to make it to school this semester, because his papers, like the government's holding his papers and he's not being allowed to cross the border. That was just a common experience that he had to go through. And that's from, the perspective of a more privileged person from Gaza who has the ability to go to college in the US and has the, it's still that difficult to leave. And so, yeah.
So you've been into the West Bank?
Yeah, but I've never been to Gaza.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you studied abroad in Jordan, which is a tiny country north of Israel?
It's directly to the east. So it's the East Bank of the Jordan River. So that's what the West Bank. The West Bank is west of the Jordan River.
Yep.
Jordan is east of the Jordan River. And so I chose to study abroad there because while I was at Earlham and learning so much about the occupation of Palestine and the injustices that had been done to Palestinian folks that I knew there, and so I was inspired to learn Arabic and to study abroad in Jordan and learn more about the issue. And when I got to Jordan, I realized that 90% of the capital city is Palestinian refugees who were expelled from Palestine in 1948 and in 1967.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah, 90% of the capital city.
Why don't more people know that about Jordan?
I don't know.
It's not like a secret, right? That's just like a fact of life that is just a thing that people understand.
And it's a big part of the culture in Jordan because there's also the folks who are Jordanian. It's like you're Palestinian Jordanian or you're Jordanian. Yep. And different cultures, but still also like similar in many ways.
And they're neighbors, right?
And neighbors, yes, have been neighbors. And and so, and in rural, more different parts of Jordan, you'll find a much larger population of Jordanians compared to Palestinians.
Right.
But just in what is the capital city.
Right. Because so often
Palestinians,
refugees go to urban environments.
Yeah, exactly.
Where there's more infrastructure, more work.
And whole parts of Jordan, like I worked at one point in a Palestinian refugee camp. And I remember I got there and I was like, what? A Palestinian refugee camp? Like, what's that even going to look like? I was imagining tents or how you imagine a new refugee camp. But you go there and you can't even tell. It's just part of the city now because it's been built up because they've had so many decades of living there. But I mean, imagine like you get expelled from your home. You expect you're going to be able to go back. And so there's people who still have the keys to their homes that now have other people living in them that were forcefully taken from them. And that's just a huge part, including my host family. The host family I lived with are Palestinian. And so my host grandparents could tell stories about being in Palestine, but my host parents and my siblings who are my age, they feel Palestinian, but they've never been allowed to return. And so that was a difficult thing because I would say, oh, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is literally, it's less than 100 kilometers from where I was living. It's less than a 2-hour drive, except for it takes half a day or more to get there because of the border and how difficult it can be to cross the border.
And you had access to doing that because of who you are.
Exactly, because of my American passport.
And they did not have access to doing that.
Exactly.
Did they literally not have access, or was it something they could do, but they understood that it was unsafe?
There were things, I mean, it's a good question. I think some of them felt as though they could not, and truly some of them would not be allowed to. Even I had to lie in order to get in.
Wow.
Yeah, they would ask, oh, what are you doing in Jordan? Like, why are you studying Arabic? What are your thoughts on the state of Israel? What's your activism? And we would like erase everything from our Facebook about being a part of Boycott Divestment Sanctions and part of that movement, because the Israeli government sees that as a threat, like sees it as like you are not supportive. You're not safe to be here if you support a movement like that, even though the movement is 100% nonviolent. Like these movements like that are what we need to be supporting if we don't want organizations like Hamas to be in charge.
Right.
And yet they see that as a threat. And I was crossing the border with someone who in her passport photo, she had been wearing a keffiyeh, which is the Palestinian scarf. And it's like a sign of Palestinian pride and also a sign of Palestinian resistance. And they turned her back. They didn't let her in. So there were lots of the fact that I even had, you know, felt the need at least to lie in order to get in. You know, the things that my host family would have had to say, like even calling it the state of Israel, even applying for a visa to go to Israel to them felt like a betrayal. Yeah. Because they said, that's Palestine, that's my homeland. Like, that's literally my home. I still have the key to my home. And it was violently taken from me. So I will not willingly like apply for a visa to go back to my home, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. I refute this process and I won't validate it by engaging in it.
But there are some Jordanians who were able to go back. Yeah.
What is the Jordanian government's stance on the whole conflict?
I mean, it's quite complicated. There's all of the, I mean, at least all of the surrounding area were like acutely affected by it and very aware of it happening, obviously. Just like if something like this happened to Canada, we're going to be, if some foreign nation just came in and took over Canada and said, this is ours now, and sent all the refugees to America, we're going to be more aware of it. And we're going to be more like, hey, that's not cool. Like, that's not okay that happened. Yep. And so at large, the region, people are very passionate about what happened and about what they want to see happen in the future. The government, though, like maintains its diplomatic ties with Israel, blah, 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 you know? Yep. So, yeah.
But in this like moment, right? It's been a month and a half.
Yeah.
2 months almost.
Yeah.
More accurately. What do you wish, like, I'm your friend, I'm your peer. Like, what do you wish I knew? And separately, what do you wish I was doing?
Yeah. That's such honestly, a good question. You know? Yeah. I really just wish that people understood that we live in a country that has been uniquely fed a very specific narrative about what happened, and a narrative that dehumanizes Palestinians, and that our nation is playing a central role in continuing rather than resolving this conflict. I think since the 70s, Israel has been the #1 place that we send military aid to. And that military aid, sure, part of it is the Iron Dome, which protects and blocks any missiles that are sent, which come from Hamas. Like, the government in the West Bank doesn't send missiles. So it protects Israeli homes from that. And so that's one part of it. And I personally think that's fine. I think we should also supply Gazans with that. I think if we're going to be supplying an Iron Dome, like I support like allowing people to truly defend themselves. That is Israel defending itself, right? What's not defending itself is going into another country, like going into Gaza and massacring people, trying to root out Hamas, quote unquote, which is what they're doing, which you can't do. Like, they know that's not a thing. Like, people, sure, you can take away leaders of a movement, but as long as you are treating people as inhumanely as Palestinians are being treated and have been treated since 1948, there will be resistance. And when you don't give people nonviolent avenues to resistance, there will be violent resistance. So in my mind, it's more like an excuse, really, to go and do what they want to do anyways.
So then I have two sort of tributary questions. it sounds like, I mean, you studied global studies. I know that you have done extensive international travel to other parts of the world that also are sort of steeped in conflict. So, you know, let's at some point talk about some of what you know from a scholarly perspective about conflict management and global conflict. But also, I mean, I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask, like, how do you respond to people who take issue with the characterization that Israel is treating Palestinians in an inhumane way when the Israel-Hamas war was incited by the treatment of Israelis by Hamas?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah. So it just goes back so far how Palestinians have been treated since this started. And like just some examples of that, political prisoners are taken all the time, like college kids. My friend, I actually saw someone I graduated from college with, a Palestinian, who is now, he's an assistant professor. I saw him in the background as I'm watching the news. Like his face popped up, and thank God it was not in one of the situations where people have been killed, because my other friend who I mentioned from Gaza, in the first few days of bombardment of Gaza, his sister, who's 30 years old, was killed. Her and her husband and their 2 young children, and her husband's parents and their entire family were wiped out. None of them have anything to do with Hamas at all. I don't even know if they voted for Hamas. And, but anyway, so I'm watching the news 2 days ago, and I see my friend on the screen, and he was behind his student who was being released from prison in the hostage exchange. And she's a student in college who's a well-spoken political activist. She hasn't done violence, but she speaks out and she'll resist nonviolently. And she's been in prison. And there's so many, there are thousands and thousands. I think right now there's 12,000 Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli jails, where people historically have been severely mistreated, tortured,
how
food
many
withheld from them. 12,000.
Like, what is the population of the West Bank and Gaza?
That's such a good question. I mean, Gaza is a couple million.
Okay.
But in the West Bank, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But it's a lot. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Everyone knows people who are imprisoned for their political action. And I mean, that is an injustice. The fact that there were even women and children being held in, in these prisons. It's so interesting because Hamas took these hostages in a horrible way. But also, why does the state of Israel in their state prisons even have women and children to release? 14-year-old boys were released in that exchange. 14-year-old boys shouldn't be in prison, for throwing stones at soldiers. And so, like the daily inhumane treatment. My other friend who lives in Ramallah, he would always talk about how he'd be delayed getting to high school because checkpoints would pop up between his house and where he went to school. And so when he started going to school there, he could drive freely. And then the next year there was 1 checkpoint. So it would take him 20 minutes longer because he had to get through the checkpoint to get to his school. Year after that, now there's 2 checkpoints. And so it takes him an hour to get to school. To live through this daily dehumanization. When I traveled, so I went to Ramallah, to the West Bank, because I had friends there and I stayed with them. And then I wanted to travel to Jerusalem. And it's literally like a 10-minute drive. It's extremely close, but it takes an hour or so to get there because you have to go through checkpoints. You have to go through the border crossing. And when we went through the border crossing, they came on there's, like 18-year-old kids who are in the Israeli Defense Forces because each citizen of Israel has to serve time with the military, or they can choose to say, I don't want to be in the military, but I'll serve in another avenue, like through volunteering with social work or something like that. Some people choose to do that. Who are like kind of like nonviolent conscientious objector kind of thing.
Yep.
And so which I can't imagine. Imagine you're an Israeli who's then forced to go do this. There are many people in Israel who are horrified by how their government treats Palestinians. And then to say, I have to now be a part of this.
Right.
I can't imagine how that feels. But anyway, so I'm on the bus going from Ramallah to Jerusalem, and these 18-year-olds, you know, with their machine guns get on the bus, and they took everyone who looked brown off the bus. And they let me and my friend who were white just sit there. They didn't even say anything to us. They just walked right by us. And they made everyone who was a person of color go through the line and show their ID and get checked and then come back on the bus. Just the kind of like the level of racism that is built into the system and the anti-Arab sentiment that is just built into the system is a daily oppression that people face. Not to mention homes being bulldozed, settlers who are, you know, imagine you're living in your home in the West Bank, and now all of a sudden your neighbor, like your neighbors are all expelled from their homes, and now there are settlers living there who have guns and surveillance. And settlers will frequently perform acts of terrorism, just like people in Hamas will. I mean, it's not, you know, I'm not excusing it on either side. I'm sure lots of those soldiers in Hamas got carried away and way too excited to take out their anger and kill Israelis brutally. That's not acceptable. But I think I want people to understand that it doesn't come out of nowhere. Like, it comes from a long experience of being oppressed and humiliated and mistreated and scared every day.
And it sounds like being denied freedom.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Yes. Yeah.
You're getting emotional. What, like, yeah, it's just, I guess I didn't know how closely and intimately you'd been exposed to this part of the world and the people that we're talking about.
Yeah.
That these are your friends.
Yeah.
And you've seen what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. To just think, like, that's what I really want people to understand is, like, imagine that you're there.
Yep.
And imagine just living under this oppression every single day. And that any fight that you try to make to right the situation, like, that people just label you a terrorist, you know? Like, I've been intimidated to speak out because I know that people just misunderstand. We're intentionally taught to think about this in a black and white situation where Arabs are terrorists, Muslims are terrorists. It's like, that is just so unreal. And I fundamentally believe that if what happened to Palestinians happened to any of us, the same thing would happen. The same results would happen. A Hamas would come to power.
Especially over the course of 70 years, right?
Yes.
Because I think people can get away with saying, I would never respond that way. I would never react that way. I would never blank.
Yeah.
But there's a generational aspect to it. And there's a sense of hopelessness and desperation. And how do people, you know, people are willing to do riskier things and things they never imagined they would do when there is a sense of hopelessness.
Yeah. And, like, this feels like the only chance to, like, save yourself, save your family. People living, the thing that's so interesting is that, like, it has been as dire. Like, October 7th, the situation up until then was not stable. It was not, like, okay. It was not functional. It was, like, an extreme state of oppression where there's been a blockade on Gaza. There's been sanctions on Gaza for years. For years, it's been difficult for people to have access to food, to water, to medical care, to all of these things. There's a whole branch of the UN that specifically works on the Palestinian issue, helping Palestinian refugees because of how long they have been experiencing the state of being refugees for so many years, that they've experienced instability that is no fault of their own, but that is caused by the state of Israel and what the state of Israel does to them. So yeah, it's like everything I'm telling you now, like all of it could have been told before October 7th. And now with what happened on October 7th, it's just really scares me to think, because I think we have been able to be slowly shifting public opinion in the United States. You know, in my college, so many students there who came into school, who came there, who knew more than me about Israel and Palestine, at least knew it existed. They probably were on the side of Israel. They probably said, like, it's really important that there's a Jewish state because of what happened during the Holocaust. You know, it's really scary that there's, you know, suicide bombers, Palestinian suicide bombers that will have gone into like what is sovereign Israel now and bombed public places so that civilians have died. It's really horrible that Gaza sends rockets into Israel. So good thing that we're giving money to the state that would otherwise be eradicated. Like, that's how people think about it. That's what we know about it. But what we don't know is that that money is not just being used to like protect against rockets. Why are there rockets? There's rockets because of how the government is treating Palestinians. And so I just saw during my time in school, lots of folks, I mean, the most educated people at my school about the issue were Palestinians, of course, and also Jewish Americans. And a lot of the Jewish Americans who came in said, oh, like, I feel connected to the state of Israel. Like, this is, maybe I've done birthright. I feel like this is a very important thing. And during their time in school, I saw a lot of people. I was educated, I would say more of the Jewish folks on my campus kind of joined BDS, joined Students for Peace and Justice in Palestine during that process, and were like, not in my name. Like, I don't want this violence being done in my name to Palestinians. And that's something I heard a lot. And I just saw, you know, public opinion in college campuses, as people become educated on the issue, your opinions will change. You know, that's how I feel, is that like, we are uneducated on this issue, and that's why it's so easy for us to blindly support Israel in everything that it does. And so you can critique the state of Israel, you can critique the way the government treats Palestinians without saying, I think Israel should cease to exist.
Right.
And that is what's really important, and without being anti-Semitic, because most of the people
Certainly.
I learned from about how to critique the state of Israel were Jewish themselves.
Right.
And not anti-Semitic.
Right. And certainly, like, if you're saying part of the goal is to add nuance and education to our understanding of what it means to be an Arab person or a Muslim person, then we do that with the grace that we also want that for people who are Jewish.
Exactly.
And people who are Israeli. I think there's a lot of access one could have to answering the question, like, what are the negative stereotypes of Arab people or Muslims, and why is that, you know, why were all the brown people taken off the bus? I think people can find answers to that. Do you have anything you'd like to educate listeners on about, like, what's beautiful about the Muslim faith or Arab people in that part of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mean, even on our campus, there were a number of Palestinian students, and I think just like being in Students for Peace and Justice in Palestine, the stereotypes that we come in with to college of like, you know, people are violent, people are serious, people are dangerous, people are maybe very conservative, those kinds of thoughts. I think just like the joy, the loudness. I remember like our first Debka is a a form of Palestinian dance, and it's basically like a lot of jumping. And so I just remember like our first school dance of like all the Palestinian guys like wore white shirts and had their keffiyehs and were just like dancing and like you know, like I think to just see like the joy, that's something that so many Americans, we do not get to see. That's not shared in our media,
right?
You know, and I think when I landed in Jordan and lived with my host family, I remember even the first night being with my host family, just how warm and loving. I remember sitting on the couch and my mom sat down right next to me, like so close, like our legs are touched. It's like very, you know, not normal in US culture to sit that physically close to people, but just that level of warmth of like, you know, kind of getting in your bubble, but in such a loving way. And just, yeah, just the jokes, just the joy, the laughter, the loudness. I remember it snowed the first day I was in Jordan, for which I was unprepared because we're going to the desert,
yeah,
you know?
I'm shocked.
What do you mean? So we're like, we're gonna wear summer clothes. We show up and it literally was snowing, which it does not do every year. It's rare. And people were so excited. And we saw vehicles that had come up from Saudi Arabia because it's that borders to the south. And I remember being out in the street and people were just throwing at random people, like random cars.
So your ask of a peer, your ask of your community is to be educated enough to see the human side.
Yeah.
And you're advocating for people to particularly take a look at the human side of the Palestinian community, simply because, as you understand it, the more prominent narratives are infused with the human side of the Jewish and or Israeli narrative.
Exactly.
So you're not discouraging people to take a close look at the human side of that. You're encouraging that, but you're also kind of acknowledging that that's more accessible.
Yeah.
And so what you're bringing to the conversation is your own personal window. Like we can get a look into the experience of the people of the West Bank and the people of Gaza, and the Jordanian Palestinian people, refugee community, through you.
Yeah.
That's something you're offering us.
Yeah, I'm hoping. And, you know, I wish this hadn't been, I studied abroad 10 years ago. I was in college, I graduated from college 9 years ago. The last time I was in Palestine would have been 2017. And so it's been a long time.
You went to Palestine in 2017?
Yeah, because I went back to Jordan and studied Arabic more while I was there. And I went back to Palestine also to visit friends and bring a friend from the US visited, and I wanted to make sure she saw it. And that time when we went back, we went to Bilain, which is a community in Palestine where they've been having a protest every day or every Friday for years now, and they invite people to come with them. And so I think at the time what they were protesting was the destruction of olive trees. And so olive trees are very culturally and economically significant in Palestine. They take a super long time to grow. Olive oil is delicious there and used in everything raw, like not necessarily for cooking, but just amazing in all the salads and all the hummus, in all the food. And there are settlers who had come out and just destroyed, like uprooted this community's olive trees, destroyed them all. And so we were protesting there, and I was just kind of, I mean, we got pepper sprayed. It was just for peacefully protesting. Like we were not crossing any borders. We weren't going anywhere we weren't supposed to be. And still we got pepper sprayed. But yeah, so I wanted to, so that was the last time I was there. And Yeah. I think in terms of the perspective, yeah, I wish that people just had more exposure to which, how do we get that? You know, how do we get that exposure? I'm so lucky that I was able to do that, you know?
I think it's so scary. It's really scary to be asked to humanize a villain. And we have to set aside debate about whether or not Palestinians are villains, right? Like, let's set that, you know, we're having a rhetorical conversation now. But if you have in your family heritage, in your religious heritage, in your national heritage, you have some understanding that Hamas is a villain, and you have erroneously or otherwise some interpretation that means every person of this entity is a monolith that is adequately and accurately represented by Hamas. One can understand that then it feels like you're being asked to not only like forgive but embrace and then work with someone who hurt you. Yeah, which we know we can like debunk. All of that is a false scenario, right? Because Hamas doesn't represent every Palestinian, and Netanyahu doesn't represent every Israeli.
I think he has an 8% favorability rating.
Right.
Like, yeah.
So we know that there's more nuance to be had, but I think people do, whether intentionally or unintentionally, just in their gut, make these inferences and conflate things. And so I think it's just really, really scary for people to be asked to look at something so horrific. Yeah. So, because I say this because you're, how do we get the exposure? Yeah. It's like, well, I think you get the exposure by preparing people to be brave, to look at something that's very hard to look at. Yeah. And to be courageous to see through your first thoughts and impressions onto some other side of something, right? Like, listeners, please be courageous enough to like give me and Maggie the grace to like if we, you know, like that we aren't, the objective here is honestly to humanize the whole thing, to make progress towards resolution, so that so that zero people are,
let's be for zero
people are murdered, bombed, raped, occupied. Yes. Yeah. Right? Like if as like we're like two American women, like we were like freedom. Right? Like how do you, what with your global studies scholarly background, with your exposure to the world, like what honestly do you think is like a strategic path forward from like a bigger picture zoomed out political end? Like you have given us your window of insight to the real on the ground people. What do you know about bird's eye view solutions?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it's nothing.
I know.
What do you got? What do you got?
It's so complex. Like, wow. Also, everything that you said, I was like, wow, I have more to say about that actually, and that, and that. I was like, oh, how could this possibly last 45 minutes? And now I'm like, oh, I think this could be long time. But okay, I will answer that direct question, and then I also want to come back to talking. Okay, I'll just not forget the other things that also came into my mind. But answer to that question, I truly believe that, I mean, the solution will be political. It will not be military. So a political solution is something that is negotiated between governments. That means the government of Hamas and Netanyahu's government and the PA in the West Bank, and will likely involve our government because we are propping up in the biggest way the Israeli government. And so AIPAC is the strongest lobby in the country. They are
which country?
In our country. This is they're like a conservative pro-Israel lobby that are very active in Washington, D.C. They lobby for more military aid for Israel. They lobby for things like outlawing the Boycott Divestment Sanctions movement, which some states have actually done, made it illegal to protest the occupation. Yeah.
In our
great free country,
in the United
there
States
are areas that have who have said that boycott divestment sanctions, because boycott divestment sanctions has as its aims the right of return of refugees, Palestinian refugees. That means all Palestinian refugees would be allowed to return to the homes or to the places, the towns where they were expelled from. And that would mean that the population of the state of Israel would no longer be 20% Palestinian. It would be more than 50%. So there would no longer be a Jewish democratic majority. And so,
and would that literally mean like, I'm living in my house until 1948. No. I am removed from my house. You come in, you move into my house. You've been living here since 1948. And now boycott divestment sanctions does what it does, and I get to move back into this house and you're SOL?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no. It just means you literally get to go back within the state border.
Yep, I can leave. Yes. I can cross.
Yeah.
I'm living in the capital of Jordan, and now I can move back into the land that we call Israel.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, that is one of the aims. Yes, somewhere.
If I got enough cash to buy a house, I can do it.
Yep.
Because I'm sure there'd be economic forces that would make that out of whack. So you're not talking about giving Palestinians the money to be able to.
Oh, no.
You're not using those keys you still have to move back into the house. You're not being given an infusion of cash that makes it possible for you then to afford it.
Exactly.
It's just the legal ability to have the right and the paperwork that allows you to stand on a piece of land and use any money you have to exist in whatever economic market there is there.
Exactly. But that is a threat.
Even even that is untenable.
Yeah.
Which to play the game.
Yeah. Which is interesting because it is a complicated question still. Because some people would say right of return, okay, allow all the Palestinian refugees to come back to the West Bank and Gaza. And I imagine there are many Palestinians who are like, yeah, that would be great. Even just that, allow us to do that. And there are other people who say, no, allow us to return to what is now called Israel, where, that's where I lived. That's where I want to go back to. And like, of course, all of the fertile, great land was taken by the state of Israel. Like, it's like, the Dead Sea is literally on, the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, which borders the West Bank. It's dead. There's not, that land is not as great. Whereas most of the fertile coast is in the state of Israel, except for the Gaza Strip is the only part on the Mediterranean coast that is Palestine anymore.
So you said you do not believe that the military solution will get us there, that it has to be a political solution, and that it will have to include other governments, obviously, who are helping to serve as diplomats in this extremely sensitive issue.
Yeah, because already our government plays a huge role in propping up what is happening. Like we fund, like I said before, we fund the Iron Dome. That's a tiny fraction of what we fund. Mostly what we're doing is just giving weapons, loads and loads of weapons and missiles to Israel, which they're using to bomb women, children, and innocent men in Gaza right now. That's what our tax dollars are currently being used for. So we have, whether or not we know it, or whether or not we care or want a role, like we are playing a role in the bombardment of Gaza. We are paying for it. We're fronting the money, and Palestinians are paying the cost of it.
Yes.
And so, but I, just with what I had studied and the perspectives that I hold based on that, there's two thoughts I have about violence. Like military action is violence. And so one is that I don't believe that oppressed people are denied the right to respond with violence. Like I do not judge a Palestinian who under this amount of oppression fights back with violence. I think that is that's the most common time. That is the main time where humans will use violence, is when under threat, and they are under constant threat.
And the Israeli people are not?
They are also under constant threat, in a sense, in a way. However, the threat is very different because it's
less
not
well funded, less well organized, and less globally supported.
And it's also a result of what they have been doing. And that's where the fact that I believe there won't be a military solution, because what we're doing right now to Gaza, I don't imagine, sure, we can take out whoever is currently running Hamas, but when I said it's not going to get rid of Hamas, like, this is how you create a terrorist. Like, we are literally just like, if you could write a little book on how do we make people into a terrorist, it's like, you take away all of their rights, you kill their family, you leave them basically feeling like there's no other option but a violent response, and you will have created a terrorist.
Right.
And any one of us, that could happen to us, to people in our community. Maybe not every person, not every person is willing to go join Hamas, even after all of that. But you're going to create people who are willing to do that, and that would be the rational thing to do, would be to respond with violence. And so I just, it's like, what are they going to get in 10 years from now, when already over 50% of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed? 50%. Like, where do you even go? It's already the most densely populated place in the entire world because of how people were pushed out of all these other parts of Israel into this extremely dense area now.
Yeah.
And so, like, in 10 years, what are those kids? What is their narrative going to be about the state of Israel? And so that's the thing we have to understand, is for decades, people have been experiencing this oppression.
Right.
So how are they going to have a better narrative? And it's like, we have to start with the state of Israel has to start with treating people better in order for there to be a better narrative. The people with power are the ones who have the power to change the situation. And that's why it is not on the Palestinians to change the situation, in my opinion, even though they fight extremely hard to do it. And there's so many Palestinians who really push for these nonviolent measures and say, we are not going to win through violence. We will not win through suicide bombing, because that just makes people fear us more and justify, in a sense, how they treat us. And so many, the vast majority of Palestinians have not and would not respond violently. They're surrounded by soldiers every day in the West Bank. There were parts when I was in the West Bank, there were places that I could go. I'd be walking down the street, and I'd be with a Palestinian friend. They'd be like, yeah, I can't go that way, but you can. And it's like, literally, because I have the American passport, I can go there, but they can't. And so there's people, Palestinians are used to living around Israelis, but only Israelis in military uniform, except for those folks who do live in mainland Israel. But Israeli civilians are only used to living around Palestinians while they are also in uniform. So it's wild the way that, like, people can live so physically close and still be so at odds, which I suppose we also shouldn't be surprised by, given how bad, like, racial dynamics are in America. But I remember, there was an Israeli friend that I made when I was traveling, and at one point I was talking to him when I was living in Jordan. He said, oh, so who are you hanging out with? Like, who do you spend time with where it really feels good for you while you're there? And I said, oh, my host sister, who's Palestinian, And he said, no, but who do you, like, really connect with, where you're like, yeah, these are, like, someone I'm just on the same page as? Like, I'm like, yeah, my host sister. And he's like, okay, but, like, she's Palestinian, like, you're American. How is that a thing that you can really? And I said, you're Israeli, I'm American. How can we be on the same page? And he said, oh, well, our cultures are more similar. Like, and for me, that was wild. Someone who, like, and he's pretty liberal, like we talked so much about the conflict, and he's more conservative than me about it.
Right.
But it's also a lot more liberal than most Israelis.
Right.
And for him to still just be genuinely asking that question, like, but is this person like human enough that you can connect with them? That was terrifying to me.
That's interesting. Well, it is terrifying. It's horrible. It's horrific.
Yeah.
I say it's interesting because just last night, I watched on Netflix, there's a sort of an interestingly styled documentary film edition of the book Stamped from the Beginning. Have you heard it or heard of it, read it? Ibram X. Kendi is the author, historian, who wrote an incredibly thorough history of racism in America. And it really starts with a king, I think in 1444, Portugal, who, I guess long story short, sort of haphazardly imported some African slaves and saw that it was to the benefit of the economy that they had the African slaves, because as opposed to the Slavic slaves that were by then traditional in that part of the world, the Africans couldn't run away inconspicuously, right? They were very visually conspicuous, very difficult. It was very difficult for them to escape slavery. And he then started the transatlantic slave trade. Gosh. And in order to justify the kind of, it doesn't make sense to say the worsening of the institution of slavery, but in order to justify the way that they were going into a country and stealing people under no guise of war even, right? They created sort of a narrative that Africans were beastly and subhuman. And that is basically the seed that grew into even the racism that we have today. And so basically my point is anyone who needs to take a moment to understand what you're saying better, I think there's some parallels in terms of how did the narrative get to be that a Palestinian person, an Arab person, a person in the West Bank, a person in Gaza, a person of color is inferior? How did the narrative come to be that they are in any way unrelatable or less human, fundamentally so? And so for people who are grappling with that idea or feel resistant to anything we've said, anything you've said, I encourage them to watch that if they have access to Netflix. Sorry, that sounds really good, intense and random, but no, I like it. Yeah. Well, we have a low battery warning, so I think we probably have like 15 to 20 minutes. And I would charge it, but I can't because the microphone.
Oh, there we go. I like having it's probably best that we have an actual timeline on this.
Why did this stop working?
Uh-oh.
This used to have a light. Your light's on. My light's on.
Can you hear us?
Interlude. One moment. Testing. Okay, it's coming through.
Okay, cool. That's good.
All right, so listeners, in case we dipped out,
listener who may still be with us. Lucy, are you listening? That's our mutual friend who would know listen to this for sure.
She better.
Yeah, even Lucy isn't listening anymore. We've lost it. Mom, are you still there?
Wow. I'm thank you. Let's see, where did we leave off? You were giving political solution, not military.
Yeah.
What else?
A political solution, I fundamentally believe, will not come at the goodwill of any of our politicians. It will come because we fight for it. And so Palestinians have done an incredible job, Palestinian civil society, of fighting for resolution, fighting for statehood for Palestine, because also it's like the state of Palestine hasn't even been recognized by many countries, although I think that recently changed, but they don't have the right in the West Bank to have their own police force or like run their own. They don't get a military. Like they don't have full sovereignty, obviously, over their country because settlements keep popping up and they're controlled constantly by military occupation.
Why would, when you say settlement, I mean, you're talking about Israeli people.
Yeah. Zionists. Oh, we didn't even talk about Zionism.
So why would someone want to move into the West Bank? It kind of sounds like, and I really don't want to be disrespectful here to Palestinians, but it doesn't sound like somewhere I want to move to. Can I be blunt about that?
Yeah, because it's had, it's purposely deprived of resources.
Right.
And so, yeah, folks who believe in Zionism, which is the creation of a Jewish only homeland, which
is that what that has to mean?
Yes. I mean, Zionism, yeah. The concept of Zionism is like a Jewish majority state. That's a Jewish homeland. So that's why American Jews can move to Israel, but even Palestinians whose families still own two-story homes there cannot. Any one of our friends who's Jewish could move there.
So when people say the word Zion, they're talking about an Israel only.
Well, Zionism is like this movement. There's this whole, oh, wow, I used to know so much about this that I have since forgotten, but there's many writings and things, but it's a political ideology that people can believe in and say, okay, I believe that there should be a Zionist state. I believe there should be a state that is just for the Jews to have a safe place.
And is it a biblical reference, the word?
Yeah, it's biblical reference, but it's a modern, last 100 years.
Yeah.
Or at this point, maybe a little over 100 years, theory. And so there are Zionists who believe that the West Bank should also belong to the state of Israel. They don't want the West Bank to be Palestinian, which many Israelis are very happy with the West Bank being on its own, being Palestine. But there's others who are not, and so they want to take that land also. And so, yeah, it's the extremists. It's like they're also considered extremists within Israeli society.
Right.
And so these extremists will go out and set up shop in the West Bank and just are slowly trying to take more and more of that territory. Yeah. But I don't remember how exactly we got onto that. But the solution, Palestinians have been doing incredible work resisting. Some, there's so much activism that happens. All of for example, prisoners' rights currently are due to what the prisoners have been all these Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons who are categorized differently than Jewish prisoners. That's why it's an apartheid state. There is apartheid in Israel because Palestinians have different rights than Jewish folks have in the state. And so, and I don't think that should be hard for anyone to understand why that's not okay. In America, if Black people, it wouldn't be that Black people had certain rights, white people didn't. It would be white people had certain rights that Black people didn't, which existed. We had that. It was Jim Crow. And that was deemed, oh yeah, that's not democratic. That's not equality. That's not right.
Right.
And so that still does exist in the state of Israel. And so prisoners have fought through hunger strikes and other nonviolent means for improving their rights and have called attention globally to how they're treated and have won improvements. And there's lots of examples of Palestinian activists who have fought back and who have won things. And so I think all of us are also going to have to fight. And so honestly, I think what has felt the most alarming for me during this time is that I know exactly what we need to do. We don't even need majority of Americans to be with us. We just need a couple thousand people who are willing to get arrested. And we could just go shut down like every airport in America. We could just keep doing that every day. It would take more than a couple thousand, I guess. But if we had like 20,000 people, which there are 20,000 people willing to put themselves on the line to end what is happening, we'd be able to do it. But I think, and that is because of civil disobedience. Like what we need to do is civil disobedience. And so that's different than protesting. Protesting is super important and we need to be doing it. And there have been incredible protests happening across the country. But what's more important is civil disobedience. And an example of that is my friends and many other people in Seattle who, when the warships were leaving with our weapons to go to Israel to be used to bomb Gaza, they blocked the entrance to the warships in Seattle at the port so that they couldn't leave. And so that kind of disobedience is what we need to be doing. I remember during...
Wait a minute. That sounds... That's an escalation, right? I guess, like, I know that what you're talking about is different than what's going on in the Middle East. But I guess I have this, like, reductivist narrative around what's the problem there is escalation. And what you're proposing here is escalation.
I love that you picked up on that, because that is what, as a peace and global studies student, that's what we all went into school thinking. Like, I just want to get everyone to sit down and talk. Well, you can't get a bully and their victim to sit down and talk because the bully doesn't have a reason to listen. You have to build up that person's power to the point where they both come to the table with power. And so we need to find ways to give Palestine power. And the way to do that is here in America, I believe, is for us to shut down the operations of different everyday things.
I have another question. I'm weary of putting my nose in someone else's business, having heard stories about white saviorism, right? Like, having learned, right? Like, there are scenarios in which good, well-meaning white, Christian or not, people have gone out into the world and asserted their will, seemingly on behalf of a population in a way that wasn't helpful. How would I know that what you're proposing is different than that?
Yeah. I love you. I love you so much. Yes, that is, like, so also was such a part of my learning as a peace and global studies student, because I agree with you 100%. That happens all the time. And also, in this situation, Palestinians are, like, explicitly putting out the call and saying, Americans, we will not, like, this fight, you are already in this fight. Like, you are funding the other side.
You're already in it.
You're already in it. What side are you on?
Yeah.
And so we are being given direct orders, direct, not orders, but requests, like calls for help. Please do something. We're being killed with weapons that you buy. Can you please stop your government from doing this? And the way that we stop our government from doing that is, I mean, it's
exposure.
Exposure, exactly. It's like one part of it is changing people's thoughts. But already 80% of Americans support a ceasefire. What we need to do, and it's so interesting because I think, especially in this day and age, after the Black Lives Matter movement, not after, I mean, still as the Black Lives Matter movement fights on, but after what happened with George Floyd's murder and the resulting
the continued practice of state lynching of Black people.
Yes, exactly. And the response, like how big that response was, there's still people who think like, oh, but the protesters, they turned people against. Like there's still people, I think, who believe that the Black Lives Matter movement was a net negative, like liberals who believe that, oh, but it was too confrontational, maybe, but that is not actually historically what we see happening. What we saw is that it changed laws in the favor of solving this problem of state-sanctioned lynching of Black people. And so it's the same thing with, we learn now about how wonderful Martin Luther King was. Well, at the time, people hated him and thought he was crazy and thought he was like so annoying that he was always shutting things down and fighting back. And only with seeing how that civil disobedience, they weren't just protesting, they were disobeying, they were blocking roads, they were stopping the functioning of society until people said, hey, I hate that that's happening. And the government had to say, okay, we'll make a change. Okay, we're finally listening. You forced us to listen. So that's what I learned through my degree, is that you take power. Like, nonviolence is a strategy of power, and that we are only, like, this is a conflict. Israel-Palestine is a conflict, currently violent. How do we transform it into a nonviolent conflict?
Right, because they're not just going to come to resolution.
No, exactly. Like, otherwise it wouldn't be going on if we could just come to resolution.
Right.
It is a conflict. We need to fight in the conflict, because currently a resolution would just be, oh yeah, Palestine just continues to suffer, doesn't have any of their rights because of the unequal balance of power.
Right.
So that's how, for me, it's felt hard, because I know what I need to do. Like, I know, and having been an organizer, like having been a union organizer, I know exactly, like, we just need to get a team together. We need to go out and talk to different folks who are already supporters, and we need to get people ready to put themselves on the line, and we just need to go shut things down, shut down the roads.
But I still don't really feel ready to do that.
Like, I know,
I hear you.
Nor do I, and that's how I feel so complicated about this. Yeah.
But is there, you don't, okay, if the issue is exposure and civil disobedience is the schnazziest tool for exposure, is there like a less schnazzy tool for exposure? Like, I sound like a jerk.
No,
I'm
being real, Lindsay. I like
I'm a busy lady. I don't have the time to shut down the airport. I also have a lot of moderate friends. I have friends on the other side of this issue.
Yeah.
I went to happy hour the other night, and my good friend said some very passionate things about what he thinks about civil disobedience, and it's from the perspective of a liberal who cares about political
exactly
rights, right?
Yeah.
You know, defund the police movement did worse things for our political priorities than anything else, you know, stuff like that. So people have different perspectives, and there's also just the reality, the lived experience of, like, where's the nearest airport, where's the nearest freeway, how much time do I have, you know, like, is there,
and it's scary, like, there's the fear, because do I want to go to jail? No, you know.
And so I guess what you're saying is you're making for an argument that this issue is the issue of all issues.
I wouldn't say issue of all issues, but it is a huge issue that we as Americans play an intimate role in. And I want us to be more aware of that, and more, I think right now, yes. I mean, I think what's happening in Palestine, people are being wiped out on the basis of their race.
Yeah.
Like, whether or not it technically fits the definition of genocide, I don't quite remember. There's certain things you're allowed to wipe people out on. It's political. I think that's why some people would not call it a genocide, because it is not on their race. They're saying, oh, it's because politically, because they support Hamas.
Yeah.
And you're apparently allowed to mass murder people for that, like, literally, without it being called genocide. And genocide, it has to be on the basis of religion, of race, of some other defining factor of their identity, because politics apparently does not count as identity enough. But I would call what's happening a genocide.
Yeah.
And it's happening right in front of our eyes right now. And I always asked myself, like, what would I have done during the Holocaust? I remember always thinking, like, I would have done something. And now we're watching it happen to people I know. And, like, I'm not doing anything. I'm, like, sitting here, you know, living my life comfortably. And that feels so hard. And that's why, like, it's such a hard issue, because I agree. Like, I also right now I'm not ready to go get arrested. And I think, although I believe that is ultimately what will change it, there are people who are willing to do that. And we can, like, a movement has so many levels. And while I used to be in a level where I was doing that, I am not currently, but there are ways that we can do things. You know, we can make it easier for those people to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I feel I'm embarrassed. I just feel like, you know, maybe I'll regret saying stuff, but in the spirit of being vulnerable, like, I genuinely, you know, do as much as I can for this community. So it's just, like, really hard to think about making space for doing as much as I can for what seems like a different community.
Yeah.
You know, so it's really hard to figure out how much ownership to take over a place I don't have a physical connection to.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just say thank you for helping create sort of a physical connection, you know, with your stories and your experience and bearing witness. And I hear you in those, like, the layers. Like, there are other ways to support. Yeah. I'm just trying to make, you know, like you said, like, how do you make space and give more? Yeah. But it sounds so gross to hear my even self say, you know, it's like from my home that is warm. Yeah. And has food in it. It's mostly mismanaged rotten food in the refrigerator, but it's my fault and not my government's fault or not my oppressor's fault. Exactly. Not even your own government, your neighbor's government. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But that's the challenge, is to grapple with these icky feelings and get through onto the other side, right? This is conversation 1. And that's why I'm so happy that you said that, because I don't think it's wrong. I don't even think, like, the way that we're feeling right now is how so many Palestinians feel as well while they're in it. Like, what can I do? What extent am I willing to go to? Like, I have this level of safety and stability. Like, what can I do? You know? Yeah, it's very parable of the sower. Yeah. Oh, our book club. Yeah. But obviously it's the other way around. But yeah. But yeah, it's, you know, I think there's, like, one thing, I don't know, that gives me hope is that Palestinians have been through so much and they are going through so much now, and, like, nothing is going to erase them or their struggle. That's just it. And we are going to, unfortunately, probably have much of our lives to support them in their struggle. Yeah. But hopefully in our life, we will see resolution to their struggle. At least resolution to the occupation and the bombardment of Gaza and the way that Gaza is currently, you know, sanctioned and oppressed in an open air prison. Like, hopefully those are things that we will see resolution to in our life. But, you know, Palestinians are going to keep fighting. That's what we know for sure. And we're going to have a long life to be able to do what we can. And I'm hopeful that in the future, as our minds change, our politicians' minds can also change. We are up against an extremely wealthy lobby. AIPAC is running smear ads against any politicians, U.S. politicians, who speak out for a ceasefire. But they have money, but we have people. And if we continue to try and share the truth of what's happening in Palestine, like the stories of Palestinians, and humanize what's happening, I think what has been happening on college campuses will also happen outside of college campuses, where people's hearts and minds are able to be open to the situation. Yeah. And there's the wisdom of knowing that the human fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Oh yeah, what was the fawn again? Fawning is like trying to appease your oppressor. Trying to work within the traumatic environment to sustain a certain kind of safety. Yeah. But the fight or flight response, like, I mean, I guess my long-winded point is just that taking some action of any kind, your body responds to that. You know, like, you don't need to, we're not going to be able to resolve this issue, but we can use agency to do something. And maybe we're not ready to go to Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport tomorrow. Shut it down yet. But that doesn't mean that we can do nothing. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Lacey. We can do this again if we feel so moved. Yeah.
It was very special. Thank you for listening and asking such incredible questions.
Thank you for sharing your incredible experience and for bearing witness for all of us, because, well, I shouldn't say all of us, but for the many of us who will hear your words who have not had that exposure firsthand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.